So in 1937, technocracy was first described as the science of social engineering. Therefore, the founding principles to this philosophy are deception and psychological warfare. And it's all in pursuit of this one-world approach. And they all seem to talk about it. For example, here's John Brennan talked about dissolving the nation-state.
Nation-states are under increasing challenge and threat. More and more, we see individuals in different quarters of the world who are identifying with subnational groups and organizations. And so just the authority of nation-states and governments, I think, is being looked at in a different way than it did just 20 years ago. And so this is one of the things that we really have to be able to understand and anticipate and work with foreign governments. Because if you're going to have basically a dissolution of the nation-state structure that we've had for centuries, it's really going to be even a more chaotic world.
The problem is that this war on nation-states cannot succeed without first collapsing the U.S. As far as I can tell, the plan is to move the nation away from a constitutional republic into an official democracy, into socialism, into globalism, and then finally into this weird, technological feudalism. And I quote, "The attack plan uses psychological, informational, asymmetric warfare to destabilize America and drive society out of objective reality into the madness of subjective reality." End of quote. So if you follow politics, doesn't it feel like we're all living in different realities? Yeah, we're in the subjective phase right now, and this divide is only going to get worse. All of this is quite insidious, but this disparity within our reality is not organic. As with most of the problems we face, it's manufactured and exploited. One of the first steps is to attack language, and I quote, "The basic tool for the manipulation of reality is the manipulation of words. If you can control the meaning of words, you can control the people who must use them." End of quote. Now, we've seen this play out within politics repeatedly. This has reached a fever pitch in recent years. A hallmark of cultural revolution is the degradation of language and meaning. And that's because once everything loses meaning, then everything becomes susceptible to manipulation. From the social agenda to climate change, all the way to the medical apartheid, it's all based on manipulation. Whether it's related to energy, food, water, resources, or the air you breathe, these crises are shoved at you non-stop as compelling reasons to give them total control over pretty much everything. To micromanage you in a scientific dictatorship. You know, there's a strong correlation between power and belief. So I decided to look into a few things, and I came across this quote. "When it comes to controlling human beings, there is no better instrument than lies. Because, you see, humans live by belief, and beliefs can be manipulated. The power to manipulate belief is the only thing that really counts." End of quote. And this is where things get pretty hazy. So, beliefs can be manipulated. Yeah, sure, 100% agree. And then they say that the power to manipulate belief is the only thing that really counts. Maybe. Let's go a little further. Bad actors seek to manipulate belief systems to gain control over humans. Okay, yeah, sure. They also trick them into believing falsehoods. I think we can all look around and see that. On top of that, the very word truth itself is being subverted by linguistic terrorists. So if all of that is true, then logically we have to assume that knowledge is the only thing that's really dangerous. To be knowledgeable about the very weapon they want to use against you. And so this is the main reason for pushing control over media, speech, and the internet as a whole. But there's more to the story, the half-truth. And I quote, "Just because something is not a lie does not mean it's not deceptive. A liar knows he is a liar, but one who speaks mere portions of truth in order to deceive is a craftsman of destruction." That right there is a quote that perfectly applies to the social engineers of the Davos crowd. It's when the lies and manipulation stop working, though, that these craftsmen of destruction move beyond language and into destructive action. As everyone awakens to the wide array of human rights violations and realizes the true extent of this plan, well, the technocrats might lash out, as chaos is always an opportunity, right? Which brings us to Disease X. This was actually a top priority at Davos 2024. First, what is Disease X? Well, it does not exist yet, and that's really the point. It's a theoretical virus that has not emerged, but experts believe it could be 20 times more deadly than COVID. They do not know what it's going to be, but they can say with certainty it's going to kill you faster. Okay then, sure. Anyway, this is exactly why we're going to focus on manipulation tonight. This is clearly a case of that. Seeing as COVID hysteria effectively failed to finish stripping people of their rights, I'm under the impression they want to use fear of the next pandemic as, a method of manipulating the masses into, some sort of compliance. After all, biosecurity is, as many people believe, the chosen method by which the Davos group intends to seize power over the world. Biosecurity equals a vaccine passport, digital ID, social credit score, carbon footprint tracker, bank records, and a programmable CBDC. It's all connected. If they get these aspects to the infrastructure implemented, you will be in a digital prison, and they will effectively have total control over your life, from cradle to grave. And I quote, "The COVID-19 pandemic allowed for an unprecedented shift in power and wealth from the people to the elite, and as predicted, it was not going to be a one-off event. The World Economic Forum is predicting that a new contagion will likely be born in 2025, and the media is already preparing us for it." End of quote. So, let's do some speculating. What could Disease X be? Well, we got this bit of information right here. A Chinese lab crafted a mutant COVID strain with 100% kill streak in humanized mice. This new virus attacks the brain, and they added, and I quote, "It's a surprisingly rapid death." Oh, well, how nice. Anyway, they actually started warning about Disease X back in 2017, and in 2023 they opened up this facility in the UK to start working on vaccines for Disease X. You know, the virus that does not yet exist.
The British government has unveiled a new vaccine research facility where scientists are working to prevent future pandemics. It's located at Porton Down, a high-security research facility best known for its work on chemical warfare. Experts are preparing for what is known as Disease X, or the next pandemic virus. Our health correspondent Dominic Hughes was given rare access to the facility.
The delicate task of protecting the nation's health. This is one of the laboratories at Porton Down where scientists are analysing current threats, new variants of COVID for example, and trying to identify new ones.
So, yeah, there's a couple ways to look at it. If you give government leaders benefit of the doubt, they could be afraid of a future war breaking out. I'm starting to notice a pattern that I'm not so sure I like. The point is that if World War III breaks out, I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination to assume that bioweapons will make an appearance. Hell, I'm pretty sure you could argue that the first one was a bioweapon too. However, with the US funding the research and how they immediately started to use it to change the economic system, I do get the feeling that this was all an economic ruse for the Great Reset. Deadly enough to create panic, but not deadly enough to destroy everything.
And so my concern was, and by the way, I raised this concern when in the spring of 2019, Moderna filed 4 patent applications, which had been previously rejected. And in those patent applications, they made reference to an accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen. This was in April of 2019. This is before the China virus, right? And you sit back and ask yourself the question, why would a company that has never made a commercial product, ever, why would a company that has never had any expertise in respiratory pathogens amend patent filings that had been rejected to include the language accidental or intentional release of a respiratory pathogen if somebody wasn't preparing to release a respiratory pathogen? So the point is, there was no surprise. The only thing I can say after October of 2019, when we had Event 201, and after the middle of September 2019, when the World Health Organization said that they were going to conduct a worldwide exercise with an accidental or intentional release of a lethal respiratory pathogen, which is what they said, the only surprise I had was how audacious it was that the criminals were actually telling the public that they were going to do it, and nobody in the public cared.
However, if World War III breaks out, I would imagine things would be very, very different. But yeah, I know, that's neither here nor there. I just saw this one from Josh Walkos. By the way, check him out on X, it's a great account to follow. Now, for the next one we have to talk about EcoHealth Alliance and Peter Daszak. So I'm really hoping you know who I'm talking about. Anyway, and I quote, "Peter Daszak and his Wuhan clan are at it again, but this time in Thailand. They found some new coronaviruses in a cave, and it all comes down to bats once again." So, yeah, there's another possibility. It's interesting because it would benefit them wildly if the next global disease was in fact a coronavirus, seeing as, they already have the platform for the medication. They'll tweak it, same as they try to do with all the new variants, and then boom, they're ready to make a couple more $billion. And on top of that, it does set the pretense for digital IDs, the agenda of total control and 24/7 biometric surveillance.
Why? Because in order to open an account, you need to have an ID.
Right.
And I have to say that when I started this job, there were actually very little countries in Africa or Latin America that had one ubiquitous type of ID, and certainly that it was digital, and certainly that it was biometric. And we've really worked with all our partners to actually help that being, to grow this. And the interesting part of it is that, yes, it is very necessary for financial services, but not only.
Sure.
It's also good for school enrollment. It's also good for health, who actually got a vaccination or not. It's very good to get your subsidies, from the government. So this has not only effect to the financial services. It's a very important issue.
So, for fun, for lack of a better word, let's do some heavy speculation. Disclaimer: of course, I have no idea what the truth is. This is just me talking hypotheticals. Purely speculation. So, with that being said, I get the feeling it's going to be a mutated form of Nipah virus. Let me explain, because the first time I posted about this, no one really agreed. The second time I posted about it, I had more people who were receptive, I guess you could say. So yeah, my point is, let me know what you think. Anyway, EcoHealth Alliance and Peter Daszak received new contracts for research into this particular disease from the NIH. Fauci has been writing articles and papers on this as well. Oddly enough, it's researching transmission from bats to humans. Yeah, sound familiar? And on top of that, here's an article detailing the research grant into Nipah handed out by the NIH. Now, this is a little bit out of my depth, but from what I gathered, this includes mutating proteins to identify how it would transfer from animal to human. Yeah, does that sound familiar to you? Because it probably should. But that's not all. The organization CEPI has been advocating for the development of a new vaccine. CEPI is funded by the Wellcome Trust, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the World Economic Forum. So yeah, a lot of stars are aligning here. But there is more. Human trials for this new vaccine just started 2 weeks ago. And I quote, "The first participants in the clinical trial received doses for the vaccine last week. The experimental shot is being developed by the university's Pandemic Science Institute, and it uses the same viral vector technology as the COVID-19 vaccine it successfully developed with pharma giant AstraZeneca." So, that is crazy. AstraZeneca did not successfully develop anything. As far as I know, that was taken off the market. So, on top of that even, Congress has introduced Disease X into their schedule. This is called the Disease X Act, which is pretty tough to say. I dare you to try to say that 3 times fast. So I went in to try to read a little bit about this act, and there's no summary. So that's pretty weird. However, all of this is tied into the pandemic treaty. They are using a disease that is not yet discovered as the reason for signing over national sovereignty. In fact, every single nation has signed on to preliminary agreements with the WHO, handing all directives related to pandemic responses over to them. And they have already taken it upon themselves to use this future quote-unquote hypothetical pandemic as a reason to demand nations sign on to the finalized agreement.
And then the other key, in order to have better prepared and to address the disease X, is the pandemic agreement. The pandemic agreement can bring all the experience, all the challenges that we have faced, and all the solutions into one. And that agreement can help us to prepare for the future in a better way, because this is about a common enemy. And without a shared response, starting from the preparedness, we will face the same problem as COVID. And deadline for the pandemic agreement is May 2024, and member states are negotiating. This is between countries, and I hope they will deliver this pandemic agreement by that time, on the deadline, because if this generation cannot do it, we're the lived community, we have the first-hand experience, I don't think incoming generation, the next generation will do it. So for our children and grandchildren's sake, I think we have to convert all the lessons we have learned into this pandemic and prepare the world for the future, because this is a common global interest. And national interest, very narrow national interest, should not come into the way. Of course, national interest is natural, but it's the narrow national interest that could be difficult and affecting the negotiations even as we speak.
So yeah, the Secretary General of the WHO underscored the need to ready ourselves for Disease X, expressing optimism that nations will achieve a pandemic agreement by May of this year to confront this quote-unquote common enemy. You see that? Yeah, that's manipulative language. The quote-unquote common enemy. So as stated, the deadline for this pandemic treaty is May of 2024, so mark your calendars. Interestingly enough, the head of the WHO also lamented that the public was getting in the way, and I quote, "The accord aimed at preventing another catastrophe is losing momentum due to lies and conspiracy theories." I mean, come on, don't you love being called a conspiracy theorist by this guy?
Isn't a medical doctor.
No Tedros for WHO! No Tedros for WHO!
The appointment to the organization's highest position was controversial, given that in his previous role as Ethiopia's health minister, Tedros was accused of covering up 3 major health epidemics.
Tedros is no stranger to controversy. As a former Minister of Health in Ethiopia, he has been accused of an alleged cover-up of 3 possible cholera epidemics.
Prior to his appointment, Tedros was a high-ranking member of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, a brutal and corrupt political group responsible for crimes against humanity, including bombings, kidnappings, tortures, and killings. How does a man with such a controversial past score the top position at the world's most influential health organization?
I have known Bill and Melinda for many, many years now.
While serving as Ethiopia's health minister, Tedros became intimately intertwined with both the Gates Foundation and the Clinton Foundation.
The health minister of Ethiopia, one of the ablest public servants I ever worked with.
With the backing of the 2 most powerful foundations on earth and the full support of the Communist Party of China, Tedros was a shoo-in.
We will have many body bags in front of us if we don't behave.
This is who is trying to dictate your future. Yes, that's right, the proposed treaty would allow the WHO to declare a state of global emergency to prevent a potential pandemic, not in response to a real one. It's sort of like a pandemic pre-crime. So, if you combine that with the proposed financial aid for developing nations reporting potential health emergencies, you can kind of see what they're building. They are essentially bribing third world governments to give the WHO a pretext for declaring a state of emergency. And come on, we already know the other key points that are going to be included in this quote-unquote pandemic treaty. Of course, they're going to introduce international vaccine passports and pour funding into Big Pharma's pockets to produce vaccines even faster and with even less safety testing. However, all of that could pale in comparison to the legal powers potentially being handed over to the WHO, and that's because they want to have unilateral power to punish, rebuke, or reward national governments for their compliance. It's crazy. A quote-unquote pandemic treaty that overrides national or local governments would hand supranational powers to an unelected bureaucrat or quote-unquote expert, who could exercise them entirely at his own discretion and on completely subjective criteria. This right here is the very definition of technocratic globalism. It effectively removes national sovereignty and removes public consent. So to finish up, I want to get into some of the linguistic manipulation commonly used. As you're about to see, they latch on to pandemic language as a way to instill fear in the populace, as we have talked about before, but there's a reason for this. You see, fear affects the frontal cortex. This affects decision making. If people are afraid, they aren't thinking rationally. So a really great example of this is how Klaus Schwab and the Davos crowd conflates pandemics with cyber attacks. So do you remember Cyber Polygon? It was an event that's very similar to Event 201, except they are simulating a quote-unquote cyber pandemic. You know, it's just a cyber attack, but they throw pandemic in there for that extra fear.
Masks are not sufficient. We need vaccines to immunize ourselves. The same is true for cyber attacks. Here too, we have to move from simple protection to immunization. We need to build IT infrastructures that have digital antibodies built in inherently to protect themselves.
So yeah, he pitches immunizing the internet with what he calls digital antibodies. They are always using this linguistic manipulation as a way to instill fear in the populace. Edward Bernays, the godfather of propaganda, would be very, very proud, as it's all about pulling the strings of the unconscious mind. And you know, with the world reeling from pandemic propaganda, it's only natural for the sociopath to latch onto that vulnerability. And here's a quote from Edward Bernays from his book, Propaganda. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitutes an invisible government, which is the true ruling power in our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, and our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. It is they who pull the wires that control the public mind." End of quote. You know, there is something about words, in expert hands manipulated deftly. They take you prisoner, wind themselves around your limbs like spider silk, and when you are so enthralled that you cannot move, they pierce your skin, enter your blood, numb your thoughts. Inside you, they work their magic. And this is exactly what they want to exploit. Every single solution put forth at Davos revolves around behavior modification, surveillance, and control. The insidious nature of public-private partnerships is understated as well. Corporatism is the foundation to this Davos economic plan, and you can see this very, very clearly with Big Pharma. However, that's not all. Governments are outsourcing their draconian policy implementation to corporations as a way to bypass public consent. It is very, very similar to how the US government uses big tech as a workaround to violate First Amendment rights. But the thing is that this is on a global scale, and within every single sector. They are using medical emergencies and corporate collusion in the same manner, as a vehicle to bypass public consent, and of course, to strip nations of their sovereignty. We are living through a soft coup, under the pretense of pandemic responses and biosecurity. They want to take over jurisdiction of everything in the world by saying that climate change, animals, plants, water systems, and ecosystems are all centered to health. On top of that, it's going to remove human rights protections, enforce censorship and digital passports, require governments to push a single official narrative, and enable the WHO to declare a pandemic on a whim. And so, I'll leave you with this, and I quote, "Power is not a means, it's an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One makes the revolution in order to establish the dictatorship. The object of persecution is to persecute. The object of torture is torture. The object of power is power."
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
Once again, this is HelioWave. If you like the content, like, comment, and subscribe. Share the video if you want to. If you're in a position to, consider subscribing on Locals or Subscribestar. As always, make sure you disobey those true fascistas, and yes, I do hope you have a good night.